Hey everybody, welcome to another Mythic Monday where we're going to take a look at last week's Mythic Plus healer meta, dungeon difficulty, look ahead to next week, talk about strategies and things to be prepared for. Let's get into it. Week 3 was a really good push week. Volcanic was minimally disruptive for most specs, and Sanguine can, or at least should be, something that can be managed by a lot of different specs and roles. I found it to be not too bad on my runs for the most part. I think our second shot at Fortified shows the importance of kicks and CCs. From the healer role, it's not really feasible to muscle heal through a lot of the trash mechanics as keys start to get higher, and the difference between a group that CCs and kicks and one that doesn't is staggering. You've also got to be proactive in helping yourself out with whatever your kit allows, CC and kick wise. Let's take a look at the sub-creation healer tier list for this week compared to last week. At this point, I think it's fair to say we're seeing some trends develop. Needless to say, Druid is very, very good and currently has an answer to pretty much anything any of the dungeons can throw at you. Preservation Evoker has been teetering between S and A tier as the week has gone on, and has pretty well established itself as the number 2 healer for this season. I feel like Fortified weeks are probably slightly better for Preservation, as there's less of a tendency for the group to get spread out, Hunters and Warlocks, I'm looking at you, than on bosses. Holy Paladin also seems to be establishing itself as the number 3 healer week after week, with good throughput and a load of utility, and then Holy Priest continually coming in close to Holy Paladin, and I think it's pretty clear that there's a solid line between Holy Priest and the remaining healers, and most priests are preferring the safety and throughput of Holy versus Disc. We then have the interesting case of Shaman and Monk. Coming into Dragonflight, despite repeated buffs, Shaman was looked at as the likely pick to be the bottom tier healer, and there was initially a lot of excitement around Monk and the fist weaving style. I think that what we're seeing is that Shaman at least has the throughput and variety of cooldowns to keep up with the field to some extent, while Mistweaver just doesn't. I feel like this iteration of Mistweaver would have been pretty awesome in Shadowlands with its DPS uptime and fist weaving style but lower throughput, but in Dragonflight where throughput is at a premium, this playstyle obviously isn't getting it done. Specs usually land in F tier on sub-creation for a combination of 2 reasons. They aren't very good, and they aren't being played much. If you look at Raider.io, Monk is by far the least played healer spec, and since most people who have at least given Mistweaver a try admit that it's really fun at its core, that pretty much means that it just can't keep up healing-wise. Let's hope that our next patch helps Mistweaver get out of the doldrums of Mythic Plus. I think we're at a point in the season, a month in, where the meta is being pretty well established week over week, with Resto Druid, Preservation Evoker, Holy Paladin, and Holy Priest come in as our top 4. Looking at dungeon difficulty week over week is telling us some interesting things about which dungeons are easier on Fortified versus Tyrannical, and which ones are just easy and hard in general. Don't look for much change in the top 2, with Shadowmoon Burial Grounds just being stupid easy compared to all the other dungeons with no real wall bosses and a ridiculously generous timer. Court of Stars also holds that number 2 spot for the 4th week in a row. From a healer perspective, not quite as easy as Shadowmoon. As the keys ramp up in difficulty, you will need to keep an eye on that AoE on the last boss, as it gets really nasty in higher keys. I have to say the next tier is a bit of a surprise to me and doesn't really reflect my own personal experience on the week, but Knockout Offensive comes in next. There's a lot of CCing and interrupting needed on the trash in here, even though all the bosses are pretty manageable on a Fortified week, but I'm still a bit surprised to see this dungeon as high as it is. As group gets more organized and competent in here though, it's a lot easier to deal with some of the obvious pain points that can ruin your run, like random patrols getting pulled at inopportune times and Stormbolt casts popping off like crazy. In C tier, we've got Jade Serpent and Algathar Academy. No surprise that Algathar Academy is much easier on a Fortified week than Tyrannical, although the Ancient Boss continues to be somewhat of a wall, and there are some trash abilities in here that can hit quite hard if not dealt with correctly. Post-nerf Jade Serpent is still pretty tough on Fortified week 2. The elementals at the start of the dungeon can be difficult to deal with if not positioned really well for line of sight, and even if they are positioned well, you don't have much time to react when the cast starts going out. Then the last pull before the boss is also a heck of a lot easier with some coordinated kicks on the casters as the elemental is also doing its thing. The trash from the second boss all the way to the end of the dungeon can get pretty sketchy as well, and even on Fortified week the final boss can be tough if people aren't using defensives and immunities effectively. No surprise to see this as a harder dungeon. Halls of Valor moves way down on Fortified week, it seems, which is interesting. In my own experience, this dungeon doesn't feel particularly hard, but there are some trash mobs that just seem to have an obscene amount of health, and the timer feels much tighter on a Fortified week. Still, I'm a bit surprised to see it as low as it is. And for its first time outside of the F tier, we have Ruby Life Pools. Still a tough dungeon, but I think the nerf to a lot of the trash a couple weeks ago really helped make this dungeon a bit more fair than what we saw week 1. The Circle of Fire Elementals is still rough and requires solid healing and good use of CC and defensives to make it through unscathed. Lastly, in the F tier on its own for the first time is Azurvault. I think the biggest thing here about this dungeon is really just the timer being really tight. You can brick this key quite easily with minimal mistakes. There is quite a bit of trash mechanics to manage. It's also another one of those dungeons where even on a fortified week, the bosses are still quite challenging, so I'm not surprised to see Azurvault here down in F tier, and I think it is one of the dungeons that would be a prime target for maybe a possible nerf or an extension of the timer. So this coming week, we've got Tyrannical, Raging, Storming, Thundering. This is already the second time we've seen Raging this season, and it shouldn't be too bad. Just don't forget to bring a Soothe to your groups. Make sure big priority targets that can do group wiping mechanics get soothed, and be ready to help out your tank with CCs as mobs get low, which is when they'll need help the most. Storming isn't usually too bad, but I imagine it's going to make finding that Thundering partner a little bit more challenging and stressful, and you might want to allot yourself an extra couple seconds to reach them. Storming does sometimes have an interesting effect on certain bosses, especially when you're required to be stacked in melee range. I could see some Azurvault bosses being made even worse on Storming in particular, so if that plays doesn't land any nerfs, I'd put my money on it ending up being F tier once again this week. It should be nice to get a look at what a so-called normal Tyrannical week looks like without Grievous making everything worse, and I suspect it will feel easier than week 2 did healing up boss fights. Still, Tyrannical is pretty brutal on a lot of these bosses. I wanted to wrap the video up talking about the idea of the difficulty of Dragonfight healing versus what we've seen in the past. I don't think I'm going out on too much of a limb in saying that Dragonflight Season 1 healing is quite a step up in difficulty from Shadowlands, even in Season 4 where people were raving about healers needing to heal again. So do healers carry keys now? To some extent, possibly, but that can really only be done to a point. What I think, or at least hope that everyone is learning from Dragonflight, is that survival is 5 people's responsibility. This has always been the case in very high keys, but in Dragonflight I think this idea presents itself much earlier on than what we're used to, and it's probably taken the community a little while to adjust to it. All 5 players are responsible for using their full kits to keep the group alive, meaning their kicks, CCs, personal defensives, and group utility. I think it's a good thing that Blizzard has introduced the idea to players sooner, and it will cause people to become better players in the long run, but I also think we need to change the narrative away from healers need to heal again to everyone needs to do their part to survive. So that's going to do it for this week's Mythic Monday. If you guys think I left anything out, don't forget to leave a comment. If you made it this far in the video, I'd appreciate it if you gave it a thumbs up. Subscribe to see more of my content in the future. And as always, you can check out my live stream right here on YouTube, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, 9 p.m. Pacific, where we do lots of Mythic Plus runs, have a lot of fun. Hope to see you there. And until next time, happy healing.